They say muscle memory is the last thing to leave the human body. For the man lying in Kezia's guest room, he couldn't remember his name, his home, or the face of the person who tried to kill him. But his hands remembered the weight of a blade. They remembered the exact pressure needed to sever a nerve or a life. Kezia thought she was saving a stranger from a tragic accident. She didn't know she was harboring the ghost of Seoul, a Korean mafia boss whose disappearance has triggered a bloody power struggle across the Pacific. Now, his memory is returning, and with it, the realization that the breaks weren't the only thing sabotaged that night. The hunters are closing in, and they don't leave witnesses. Hello, family. Where are you watching from? Kindly drop it in the comments so I can send special appreciations to you, and most importantly, hit the subscribe button to subscribe to this channel. Now let's go deep into the story. The Pacific Northwest fog was a thick, wet blanket over the coastal highway, turning the towering pines into ghostly sentinels. Kezia, an Angolan-American potter whose life was defined by the steady, meditative rotation of her wheel and the salt-crusted silence of her cliffside cabin, was driving home late. The scent of pine and oncoming rain filled her truck, a peaceful contrast to the storm brewing in her mind about her next gallery showing. Suddenly, the peace was shattered. A screech of tortured tires echoed through the ravine, followed by the sickening crunch of metal on stone. Kezia slammed on her brakes, her heart hammering against her ribs. She scrambled out of her truck, her boots slipping on the wet pavement as she ran toward the edge of the road. Below, a black luxury sedan, the kind of car that belonged in the high-rise districts of Seoul, not on a lonely Oregon trail, had careened into a rock face. The front end was crumpled like discarded paper. Steam hissed from the radiator, and the smell of gasoline was sharp and terrifying. Lying on the cold asphalt, having been thrown from the vehicle just before it hit the rocks, was a man. Kezia knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she cupped his face. He was a man of striking, lean power, his short dark hair swept back but now matted with grime. He wore a crisp white linen shirt, now stained with dirt and blood, and dark trousers. As she moved to check his pulse, the light of her truck's headlights caught the intricate, dark ink on his skin. Bold, dark tattoos of dragons and serpents wound up his muscular forearms and onto the side of his neck, reaching toward his jawline like a silent warning. "Hey, can you hear me?" Kezia whispered. His skin was cold, his breathing shallow. Despite the bruises and the blood, there was a refined, dangerous elegance to his features. When he finally groaned and his eyes flickered open, they were dark flints, glazed with a terrifying emptiness. He looked at Kezia, then at the tattoos on his own hands, and then back to her. "Who?" he rasped, his voice a broken, low melody. "I'm Kezia. You've been in an accident," she said, her voice providing the only anchor in his world of pain. I don't know who I am," he whispered, his eyes rolling back as he slipped into unconsciousness. Kezia looked at the ink on his neck, the mark of the Korean underworld. She knew that if she called the police, this man would be shackled to a hospital bed or worse. Something in his gaze, a flicker of raw vulnerability, moved her. She helped him up, his heavy, tattooed arm draped over her shoulder, and steered him toward her truck. She was saving a ghost, and the ink on his skin told a story of a past that was already beginning to hunt them both. 5 days had passed since the crash. The stranger, whom Kezia began to call Jaiho after finding a monogrammed handkerchief in his pocket, spent his hours staring at the gray, churning ocean from the porch. He was a man of few words, his amnesia a towering wall he couldn't climb. While his mind was a blank slate, his body held secrets he couldn't explain. One evening, Kezia returned from the village market with a heavy crate of supplies. Among the produce was a large, whole king salmon, a gift from a local fisherman. Her hands were stiff and sore from a 10-hour stint at the pottery kiln, and she struggled to find the right angle to clean and fillet the massive fish. Jaiho watched her from the shadows of the kitchen, his dark eyes tracking the clumsy movement of her knife. Without a word, he stood up. His movement was fluid and predatory, a silent grace that didn't match his bandaged wounds. He walked toward the counter and reached out, his tattooed fingers closing around the handle of her heaviest kitchen knife. The moment the steel touched his palm, Jaiho's entire aura shifted. The lost, confused man vanished. His shoulders squared, his chin tilted up, and his eyes sharpened into a cold, terrifyingly efficient focus. Kezia stepped back, mesmerized. Jaiho didn't just slice, he performed a ritual. The knife became an extension of his soul. He moved with a speed that made the blade hiss through the air. He deboned the salmon with surgical precision, the steel dancing inches from his own skin without ever drawing a drop of blood. He then began to hand-press sushi with a rhythmic, mesmerizing speed, his tattooed wrists flicking as he arranged the fish into translucent, perfect ribbons. It was a masterpiece of culinary art that belonged in a five-star soul lounge, created in a humble cabin by a man who didn't know his own name. "You've done this before," Kezia breathed, her eyes wide with amazement. "You must have been a master chef." Jaiho looked down at the knife, then at the serpent tattoo winding around his thumb. A flash of a memory, not of a kitchen, but of a rain-slicked alleyway and the sound of steel meeting bone, flickered behind his eyes. He dropped the knife as if it had turned into a snake. "I remember the weight of the metal," he said, his voice trembling with a sudden, dark realization. "I don't remember the recipes, Kezia. I remember the feeling of the blade in the dark. I don't think I used knives to feed people. I think I used them to survive." The peace of the sanctuary was shattered on the 10th night. A violent thunderstorm rolled in from the Pacific, the lightning illuminating the cabin in jagged, strobe-like flashes. Jaiho sat bolt upright in the guest bed, a strangled, guttural cry escaping his throat. Kezia rushed into the room, finding him clutching his head, his knuckles white against his temples. "Jaiho, what did you see?" "The rain," he gasped, his breath hitching. "It was raining just like this in Seoul. I remember the garage, the smell of oil and damp concrete. I remember the shadow." He began to recount a fragmented, terrifying vision. He saw himself walking toward the black sedan after a high-stakes meeting where he had asserted his dominance over the syndicate. In the periphery of his vision, he saw a man, Sangmin, his trusted second-in-command, a man he had called brother. He remembered the flash of a signet ring on Sangmin's hand as the man lingered by the rear wheel of the car, pretending to check a tire pressure sensor. "I was distracted," Jaiho hissed, his eyes wide and haunted. "I was on the phone, dealing with a betrayal in the ranks. I didn't see him cut the lines. I didn't see the pity in his eyes." The memory became a nightmare of motion. He described the feeling of driving down the Oregon Mountain Road, the sudden realization that the brake pedal offered no resistance. He remembered the frantic pumping of the brakes, the scent of burning rubber, and the moment he realized he had been erased by the one person he trusted. "It wasn't an accident, Kezia," Jaiho said, his voice turning cold and authoritative. "It was an execution, and if I am still breathing, it means Sangmin's job isn't finished." Outside, through the sheets of torrential rain, the distant glow of headlights appeared at the base of Kezia's long, winding driveway. Two sets of lights, moving slowly and methodically, cutting through the fog like the eyes of a predator. Jaiho didn't panic. He reached under his pillow and pulled out the slicing knife he had tucked away after the sushi dinner. He looked at Kezia, the vulnerability in his eyes replaced by a fierce, protective fire. "They're here," he said, his gaze locking onto hers. "They think they're coming for a dead man. They're about to find out that the king has finally woken up." The silence of the cabin had become a heavy, suffocating thing. Jaiho stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the flickering lightning. The white linen shirt he wore was tight across his shoulders, the ink on his neck seeming to pulse with every flash of light. He wasn't just a man recovering from a trauma anymore. He was a weapon being unsheathed. "Kezia," he said, his voice dropping into a low, authoritative register that made the hair on her arms stand up. "In my world, there is no such thing as a coincidence. Those lights at the bottom of the hill, they aren't lost tourists. They are cleaners, Sangmin's personal unit." Kezia felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, but she didn't let her hands shake. She had spent years building this life of solitude after her own share of hardship, and she wasn't about to let it be burned down. "What do we do? The truck is in the shed, but they'll see us if we try to take the main road." Jaiho turned to her, and for the first time, Kezia saw the true king. His eyes were no longer vacant. They were calculating, cold, and intensely focused. "We don't run yet. If we run, they hunt us across the state. If we break them here, we buy the time we need to get to the city." He looked at the kitchen knife in his hand. "Go to your workshop. Lock the door. Do not come out until I call your name." "I'm not leaving you to fight them alone," she countered, her Angolan stubbornness flaring. Jai-Ho stepped close, his presence overwhelming. He placed a tattooed hand gently on her cheek, a gesture of surprising tenderness that contrasted with the steel in his other hand. "You saved my life, Kezia. Now let me ensure you get to keep yours. This isn't a fight. It's a removal." As Kezia retreated to the kiln room, Jai-Ho began to move. He extinguished every light in the house. He didn't hide. He merged with the shadows. He remembered now not just the accidents, but the training. He remembered the years spent in the dark corners of Seoul, where a blade was faster than a bullet and silence was the greatest ally. Outside, the two SUVs reached the gravel turnaround. 4 men stepped out. They were dressed in dark tactical gear, suppressed submachine guns held at the ready. They moved with the professional gait of soldiers. The leader, a man with a jagged scar across his eyebrow, signaled for them to flank the house. Jai-Ho watched them through the slats of the kitchen blinds. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the battle trance that had made him the most feared boss in the Pacific Rim. He didn't feel like a victim anymore. He felt like a predator. One of the men approached the back porch, his boots crunching softly on the wood. Jai-Ho waited, his breath shallow and rhythmic. As the man reached for the door handle, Jai-Ho struck. He didn't open the door. He moved through it as the man stepped in. In one fluid motion, Jai-Ho bypassed the barrel of the gun, his knife hand moving in a silver arc. The blade found the gap in the man's tactical vest with surgical precision. There was no scream, only the soft thud of a body hitting the floor and the quiet hiss of the rain. Jai-Ho caught the man's radio before it hit the ground. He was no longer a stranger. He was the ghost of Seoul, and the night had just begun. The 3 remaining mercenaries realized something was wrong when their comrade failed to check in. They pulled back from the house, forming a defensive triangle in the yard, their flashlights cutting through the mist in frantic, sweeping arcs. "Jai-Ho," the leader shouted, his voice rasping in Korean. "We know you're in there. Sang-min wants your head, but he didn't say it had to be attached to your body. Bring the woman out and maybe we'll make it quick for you." Inside the workshop, Kezia gripped a heavy iron rod used for stirring the kiln. She could hear the rain drumming on the roof and the distant, muffled shouts. She prayed for the man she had rescued, realizing that the gentle Jai-Ho she had nursed back to health was only one side of a very dark coin. Jai-Ho didn't answer with words. He used the environment. He had slipped out through a cellar window and was now perched in the low branches of a massive cedar tree overlooking the yard. He watched the flashlights. He timed their sweeps. He waited for the moment when the 2 men on the left crossed paths, creating a momentary blind spot. He dropped from the tree like a shadow. The first man didn't even see him. Jai-Ho landed silently behind him, using the man's own momentum to drive him into the mud, his blade finding the pressure point at the base of the skull. The second man turned, startled, and tried to raise his weapon, but Jai-Ho was already inside his guard. He used the hilt of the knife to shatter the man's collarbone before delivering a lightning-fast strike to the temple. The leader, the man with the scar, spun around, firing a wild burst from his submachine gun. The bullets tore into the wooden siding of the cabin, shattering a window. "Show yourself," the leader screamed, his composure breaking. He had been told he was hunting a broken man with amnesia. He hadn't been told he was hunting a demon. Jai-Ho stepped into the light of the SUV's high beams. He stood perfectly still, the rain washing the blood from his tattooed arms. He looked like a statue of ancient, vengeful ink. "Sang-min always was a coward," Jai-Ho said, his voice carrying over the wind. "He sends children to do a man's job." The leader roared and charged, discarding his gun for a combat knife. It was a mistake. Jai-Ho's mastery of the blade was not just skill, it was his nature. The 2 men clashed in a blur of steel and rain. The mercenary was strong, but Jai-Ho was precise. He parried a lethal thrust, stepped into the leader's personal space, and with 3 rapid-fire slashes disarmed him entirely. Jai-ho stood over the fallen leader, the point of his kitchen knife resting against the man's throat. "Tell me where he is," Jai-ho hissed. He's in San Francisco," the man choked out. "Waiting for the shipment. The coup is already finished, Jai-ho. You have nothing left." "I have everything I need," Jai-ho replied, his gaze flickering toward the workshop where Kezia was hidden. He knocked the man unconscious with a single, brutal blow. He had the information. Now he had to lead his savior into the heart of the storm. The aftermath of the struggle was a grim scene of mud and spent shells. Jai-ho stood in the center of the yard, his chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly beginning to ebb. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had just dismantled 4 professional killers, and felt a wave of cold clarity. The amnesia was almost entirely gone, replaced by the weight of 1,000 sins and a crown he had never truly wanted, but was forced to wear. He walked to the workshop door and knocked softly. "Kezia, it's over, it's me." The door creaked open. Kezia stood there, the iron rod still in her hand, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of him. He was covered in mud and rain, a shallow cut on his cheek bleeding red against his pale skin. She didn't shrink away. Instead, she stepped forward and wiped the blood from his face with her thumb. "You're hurt," she whispered. "It's nothing," Jai-ho said, his voice cracking with a rare moment of emotion. "Kezia, I cannot stay here, and because you saved me, you cannot stay here either. They know this place now. More will come." He led her to one of the black SUVs. He searched the vehicle, finding a stash of cash, several burner phones, and a map with marked locations in San Francisco. He realized Sangmin was moving faster than he had anticipated. The shipment mentioned by the mercenary was likely the final piece of the puzzle, a massive drug and arms deal that would cement Sangmin's power with the international cartels. "I have to go back," Jai-ho said, looking Kezia in the eye. "I have to take back what was stolen, not for the power, but to end this. I want to dismantle the syndicate. I want a life where I don't have to sleep with a knife under my pillow." Kezia looked at her cabin, the place that had been her whole world. She looked at the smashed windows and the mud-caked yard. She realized that her life had changed the moment she pulled this man from the wreck. She wasn't just a potter anymore. She was the only thing keeping the king's soul intact. "Then we go together," she said firmly. "You saved your life tonight, but you're going to need someone to remind you who you are when the fighting starts again." Jai-ho felt a surge of hope he hadn't experienced since he was a child. He took her hand, his tattooed fingers interlacing with hers. "I promise you, Kezia, when this is over, we will find a place where the only thing these hands do is hold yours." They climbed into the SUV, leaving the wreckage of the past behind. As they drove south toward the city lights of San Francisco, Jai-ho reached over and turned off the vehicle's GPS. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from his fate. He was driving straight into it, with a queen by his side and a blade at the ready. The hunt was over. The reclamation had begun. San Francisco rose out of the Pacific mist like a kingdom of glass and steel, a stark contrast to the rugged Oregon coast they had left behind. Jai-ho drove the captured SUV with a cold, calculated focus, his tattooed hand steady on the wheel. Beside him, Kezia watched the city skyline, her heart heavy with the transition from her quiet artisan life to the epicenter of a shadow war. "My contacts are in the Tenderloin," Jai-ho said, his voice regaining the sharp edge of a man who ruled these streets from the shadows. "There is an old tea shop on Post Street. If the owner is still alive, he is the only one who didn't sell his soul to Sangmin." They arrived at a nondescript storefront with a fatting green awning. Inside, the air smelled of dried jasmine and ancient wood. An elderly Korean man, his face a map of 1,000 secrets, looked up from a ceramic pot. When his eyes landed on Jai-ho, he dropped the porcelain lid. "They said you were a ghost," the old man, Mr. Park, whispered in Korean. "Ghosts don't seek revenge, Park. Only the living do," Jai-ho replied. For the next several hours, Kezia watched as the king meticulously rebuilt his network. Through Park, Jai-ho reached out to the few loyalists who had been purged or went into hiding after the accident. He learned the full extent of Sangmin's betrayal. The shipment arriving at Pier 39 wasn't just drugs. It was a diplomatic pouch containing encrypted files that would allow Sangmin to blackmail the city's highest officials, ensuring the syndicate's immortality. "I need you to stay here, Kezia," Jai-ho said, turning to her as the sun began to set over the Golden Gate Bridge. "This pier, it will be a slaughterhouse. I cannot have your blood on my conscience." Kezia stood her ground, her Angolan heritage reflected in the fierce set of her jaw. "You told me I was the only thing keeping your soul intact, Jai-ho. If you go there alone, you'll become the monster they want you to be. I'm not a soldier, but I know how to watch your back." Jai-ho looked at her, the woman who had cupped his face on the cold asphalt and seen a man instead of a boss. He realized that leaving her behind was a greater risk to his humanity than bringing her along. He handed her a small, sleek burner phone and a heavy tactical flashlight. "Stay in the shadows. If I don't come out in 30 minutes, you call the one number saved in that phone. It leads to a journalist I've kept on payroll. Burn the whole thing down." As they prepared for the final strike, Jai-ho sharpened his blades one last time. The amnesia was a distant memory now, but the man he had become in that Oregon cabin remained. He wasn't fighting for a throne anymore. He was fighting for the right to leave it behind. Pier 39 was a labyrinth of shipping containers and screaming gulls. The fog was so thick it swallowed the light from the mercury lamps, creating a world of gray shadows. Sangmin stood at the edge of the dock, surrounded by a dozen armed men, his signet ring glinting as he checked his watch. "The ship is late," Sangmin hissed. "Check the perimeter again." He didn't see the shadow moving among the containers. Jai-ho was a wraith. He didn't use a gun. He used the environment and the surgical precision of his blades. One by one, the outer guards vanished into the mist, silenced by a flash of steel and a hand over the mouth. Kezia watched from a high catwalk, her breath shallow. She saw the way Jai-ho moved. He was like a dancer, a master of a lethal art form. But then a guard she hadn't seen spotted Jai-ho. A shout rang out, followed by the deafening crack of a gunshot. "Jai-ho!" Sangmin screamed, his face contorting in a mix of terror and rage. "You're supposed to be at the bottom of a ravine." The silence of the pier was replaced by the chaos of a firefight. Jai-ho dived behind a steel crate, the bullets sparking off the metal. He looked up and saw Kezia on the catwalk. She didn't freeze. Seeing a guard aiming at Jai-ho from a hidden position, she threw her heavy tactical flashlight with all her might, hitting the man's arm and spoiling his shot. The distraction gave Jai-ho the second he needed. He lunged from cover, his knife moving in a blur. He bypassed the guards, his focus solely on the man with the signet ring. Sangmin pulled a pistol, but Jai-ho was faster. He threw a smaller throwing blade he had hidden in his sleeve, piercing Sangmin's hand. The gun clattered to the concrete. Jai-ho tackled Sangmin, the two men crashing into a pile of wooden pallets. They rolled in the salt spray and blood, the brothers finally facing the truth. "I gave you everything," Sangmin choked out, reaching for a hidden shank in his boot. "You gave me a death sentence," Jai-ho growled, pinning Sangmin's arm down with his knee. "But you also gave me the chance to meet the woman who showed me what it means to be free." With a final, decisive strike, Jai-ho disarmed Sangmin for good, dragging him to the edge of the pier. He didn't kill him. Instead, he pulled the encrypted files from Sangmin's pocket, the leverage he needed to end the syndicate's reign forever. "The police are already on their way. Sangmin, I've sent the coordinates and the evidence to every major news outlet in the city. The king is dead, and so is his empire." As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Jai-ho turned away from the man who had betrayed him. He looked up at the catwalk. Kezia was already coming down the ladder. He met her at the bottom, catching her in his arms. The blood on his white shirt was a grim reminder of the night, but the look in his eyes was one of peace. 6 months later, the fog of San Francisco was a world away. The news had been dominated for weeks by the Great Syndicate fall, as the evidence provided by an anonymous source led to the dismantling of one of the largest criminal organizations in the Pacific. Sangmin and his associates were behind bars, and the ghost of Seoul had seemingly vanished into thin air. On a quiet stretch of the Angolan coast, where the Atlantic waves were warmer and the sand was the color of gold, A small, whitewashed villa stood overlooking the sea. Kezia sat at a new pottery wheel, her hands covered in the rich, red clay of her ancestral home. The piece she had once cherished was now shared. Behind her, the door opened, and a man walked in, carrying 2 cups of tea. He wore a simple linen shirt, and the dark tattoos on his neck were no longer hidden. They were merely marks of a life he had survived. Jai-ho set the tea down and watched her work. He no longer carried a knife under his pillow. Instead of a blade, his hands now held the tools of a chef in the small restaurant he had opened in the nearby village. The master of the blade was now known for his exquisite seafood, a fusion of his Korean heritage and the local flavors Kezia had taught him. "The kiln is ready," Jai-ho said, his voice soft and full of a warmth that had been missing for decades. Kezia stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at him, the man she had saved, the man who had fought through hell to protect her. "You're late. The sun is almost down." "I was busy with the final arrangements," he replied, a mischievous glint in his eyes. He led her out to the terrace, where a long table was set with a white cloth. In the center was a small, perfectly crafted ceramic box Kezia had made. Jai-ho opened it, revealing 2 rings, one a simple gold band, the other a silver hawk, redesigned to symbolize protection rather than power. "I woke up with no memory of who I was," Jai-ho said, taking her hands in his. "But every day since then, I have built a memory of who I want to be with you. You gave me my life back, Kezia. I want to spend the rest of it making sure it was worth saving." Under the light of a new moon, with the scent of the ocean and the sound of the waves as their witnesses, they exchanged their vows. There were no cameras, no bodyguards, and no shadows of the past. The story that had begun with a tragic accident and a blood-stained asphalt road ended in a celebration of 2 worlds becoming one. The Angolan artisan and the Korean king had found their own kingdom, a life of peace, achievement, and a love that was written not in ink, but in the heart. As they danced on the terrace, the world of the Mafia was a distant ghost, replaced by the reality of a future they had earned together. The end. If you enjoyed this story, kindly like, share, and subscribe to this channel.